Welcome to the newsroom. A nationwide strike was held in Israel today to pressure the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his government into agreeing a deal to bring Israeli hostages home from Gaza. The strike, called by the country's biggest labour union, comes in the wake of the killing of 6 hostages in a tunnel near Rafah, 48 to 72 hours before they were found by the Israeli forces. Well, today the walkout disrupted Tel Aviv's airport, some medical services and many businesses, but it was cut short by several hours following a ruling by the Labour Court saying the strike was politically motivated. Delano D'Souza has our report.
Takeoffs at Israel's Ben Gurion airport halted for 2 hours Monday morning. The disruptions came as the country's largest union called for a general strike to protest the government's failure in securing a ceasefire. Despite the inconvenience caused, many passengers were in support of the move.
Anything we can do to raise awareness and progress in whatever we can, the release of the hostages is worthwhile, even delay.
I feel that I support this strike because we really, all of the people in Israel want our friends and brothers to come back from Gaza.
There's no need to punish the whole state of Israel because of what is happening. Above all, it's a victory for Hamas.
A labor court in Israel ruled the strike needed to end at 2:30 p.m. local time. The decision came following a request from the far-right finance minister, who accused Israel's main union of acting like a political body. Despite the ruling, ports, banks and hospitals faced walkouts on Monday.
We are striking. It's a very hard word for physicians who are here to take care for the life and the well-being of our patient. But we are in a very, very hard situation now.
Protesters gathered in Tel Aviv on Monday, a day after an estimated 500,000 people took part in nationwide demonstrations calling for a ceasefire. Some in Israel, however, prioritized the complete destruction of Hamas over the freedom of hostages. It's a sentiment echoed by the country's hardline national security minister, who was quoted in Israeli media boasting about using his power to scuttle a deal.
Well, one of the hostages killed last week in Gaza was Ori Goldberg, a 23-year-old American Israeli. His funeral procession is being held in Jerusalem today. Those are the images we're showing you now. Now, for many, Goldberg-Polin's ordeal had come to symbolize the suffering of those held captive in Gaza, with tributes pouring in from the United States as well as from those in Israel. President Joe Biden saying he was devastated and outraged by the killing. Well, to talk a bit about the strike in Israel today, I'm very pleased now to welcome to the programme Ori Goldberg. He's an Israeli political commentator. Good afternoon to you, sir. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, what are your thoughts on the significance of the strike today? Is this a tipping point in Israel's relationship with this war?
Quite possibly. It isn't the tipping point, but it may be a tipping point. It's the first time the protests against the government have been sponsored by an institution at the national level, and this institution is not known for being groundbreaking or particularly bold in its political commitments. So if such a timid institution as our Federation of Labor Unions is sponsoring the strike, this means that its leaders feel there is enough popular will, enough popular anger to benefit potentially from being identified with the strike. I think that is a big deal. Again, it's not the tipping point because the Israeli public is very confused. It supports the war or a war. It doesn't see any other alternative to solve the security problem. But the anger at the disregard for the welfare of the hostages is immense, and it may be reaching a boiling point.
Well, what is it that you think that those who did go on strike today actually want to happen now? Because I looked at your X platform this morning, the feed formerly known as Twitter, and you said there are few Israelis now who are calling for an end to what's happening in Gaza. So those Israelis who turned out on the streets today, we know they want to secure the release of the hostages, but in exchange for what?
Well, I know it's difficult and it is confusing from the outside. It's even more confusing from the inside. Israelis have consistently failed to connect the dots and to realize that the only way to secure the return of the hostages is to end the war in Gaza. What the Israelis who went on strike today want and what they are taking to the streets for is, first of all, some sort of change. And the one change they can articulate is the return of the hostages. Remember that Israel defined two goals for this war: the destruction of Hamas and the return of the hostages. For the past 11 months, we have perpetuated, we have encouraged the lie that those two goals are commensurate and perhaps even complementary. The death of these 6 hostages, a death that was entirely preventable, has, I think, snapped that connection. Israelis now realize there's a contradiction between the return of the hostages and the destruction of Hamas. We are still unable, as a collective, as a people, to call for an end to the war. We're very much attached to the notion of security as the key principle that secures our livelihood here. But we are now realizing that this devotion to security can actually kill us. I think that is what made yesterday special. That is the cause for this anger. It is not particularly well directed or focused yet, but it is very, very tangible. There's no telling where this can go because this really is virgin territory for the Jewish Israeli collective.
You mentioned yesterday being a major day. There were about 500,000 Israelis on the street yesterday, and we've had this strike today. It is worth reiterating, though, that the strike was called off hours earlier than it was supposed to. This after an intervention by the Labour court in Tel Aviv. That court apparently accepting a petition from the government today that the strike was politically motivated. Your thoughts on that? Because it does seem that in the past, politically motivated strikes have been allowed in Israel. I mean, there was one last year, wasn't there, over the judicial reforms?
This strike was allowed. The fact that the Labour court called it off is, I suppose, a gesture of goodwill meant to placate the government, but the strike was allowed. And actually, I don't really think that the Labour court's permission is of any real importance. Israelis feel like they should be taken to the streets. 3 very large demonstrations are planned for this evening, and they're not seeking approval from the Labour court. The only way forward, I think, for many Israelis of all political stripes is various kinds of civil disobedience. So while the government might be fighting this case in legal tribunals, and remember that this government is one of the greatest enemies of the Israeli judicial system at large, including the labor courts, so this alliance is very tenuous. But while this government takes to the courts, the Israeli public, as of now, seems to be taking to the streets. These are not the same struggles, and once again, the public is not looking for the government's approval. Perhaps for the first time during the year or so that this war has been going on, this is now in many ways a struggle between the government and the governed, and not between the right and the left.
And do you think then that pressure from the streets that you're talking about will actually force this government to cut a deal? Because clearly it's been extremely reluctant to do so until this point.
I don't know. I think this is unprecedented pressure, but I wouldn't go as far as saying, like I said, this is the tipping point. I think it's a game of momentum and vibe, and in essence, it's a game of chicken. Who veers away first? The government is trying to broadcast, trying to project a united front. The protesters are less united, but they're very angry, and there are a lot of them. Once again, Israeli politics, we pride ourselves on the robustness of our politics, but actually very little changes here. This is new. We've never been in this place before. I don't know if these demonstrations can force the government out, but they don't seem to be petering out as previous demonstrations have before. This is different, and it's about momentum. We'll just have to follow closely and see.
Just a final question for you. I'd like to get your reaction to something that the National Security Minister of Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir, said just today, I'm going to quote it to you, he said, "I'm not ashamed to say that we are trying to prevent a deal and to stop negotiations altogether." I mean, quite extraordinary language, it seems, from Ben-Gvir, from a government minister, while these protests are going on. How much influence does an individual like Ben-Gvir have over the Netanyahu government right now?
Oh, he has some political clout because he holds one of the keys to the survival of the ruling coalition. But he doesn't have a lot of influence over policy, and I don't think he has a lot of influence over the prime minister. I think what is happening now is that this event is developing a physical dynamic of its own. Lines are being drawn, and the lines are being drawn in a way that they have not been drawn over the past 11 months. Again, this is no longer Ben-Gvir and the extremists against the moderates, because for the first time, there is real, tangible anger, and if you'll permit me, there's also fear. Israelis thought that people like Ben-Gvir were extremists or buffoons, but they never imagined that their incompetence or their extremism could be used to directly kill Israelis. The hostages who died up until now died because of neglect or Hamas treatment or Israeli bombings. The death of these 6 hostages who were found yesterday is really seen as totally preventable and as a there but for the grace of God go we. Ben-Gvir's buffoonery and his penchant for provocative statements, I don't think they will help him greatly at this time to shape policy. I think he's about to learn what it's like to have the public opinion turn against you in a pretty radical way.
Ori Goldberg, Israeli political commentator in Tel Aviv. It's been interesting to get your views today, sir. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.